I once taught a middle-aged gentleman who steadfastly refused to castle. So he left his king in the center in game after game after game. And in the vast majority of cases, he got checkmated. His king dead and buried in the middle of the board. When we had our first lesson, I asked him why he wouldn't castle. And he replied, "I used to castle, but I always got checkmated on the side. So now I keep my king in the center." I never succeeded in convincing him that a castled king is a safer king. I sang, I danced, he kept losing, but nothing worked. I bring this up because we're going to explore the main mating patterns that are used to checkmate a castled king. And I don't want you to join my old student and refuse to castle. A king is always a target. There's no such thing as true safety, and it can be blasted off the board at any moment. But trust me when I say that it's far more secure on the side of the board than it is in the center. Our Kill the Castled King exploration will be illustrated with monarchs that have migrated to the king side. The reason for this is that kingside castling is far more common than queenside. Why? Because it's faster. You only have to move 2 pieces out of the way to castle kingside, while queenside castling demands that you move 3 pieces. These, our final mating patterns, are used constantly. In fact, if you expect any real success in chess, these are the patterns you have to know. We'll be exploring various mating attacks, and all of them will be aimed at h7, h8, f6, g7, and h6. You'll be shocked at how many checkmates occur on those squares. I think more mates occur on h7 than anywhere else. Here's a classic scenario. Both the knight and the queen are aiming at the h7 square. And so the very typical mate, queen h7 mate, happens all the time, as we'll continue to see. Black to move, he needs to defend h7. There are 3 ways to do this. One is bishop f5. Safe, you don't have to worry about the mate. The other is h6, not only stopping the mate, but actually threatening the knight. And finally, the queen can defend. By queen d3, it guards h7 from afar. This time, white's attacking h7 along the diagonal. The h6 defense, which looked so good when the queen was on h5, isn't very good anymore since the queen would just leap in this way and checkmate you. You don't want that. So h6 doesn't work. The f5 possibility, which does block the mate, walks into something else we know, the smother mate. Knight check, and if he doesn't want to give his rook away, he might try to move the king. Check again, double check, and maybe you recognize the creation of a smothered mate. And there it is, checkmate. You don't want that either. So black really has 2 defenses. One is g6, blunting this diagonal. That's a good defense. And the other is knight f6. And the knight guards the h7 pawn, and everything is okay, and the game's about even. This balance between attack and defense is a normal part of chess, and you'll find that you'll have to do both. Even the most aggressive players in history have to, at some time, defend, while even the most defensive player of all time has to attack. In general, the more pieces the attacker has access to, the greater his chances of success. Thus, if we add one more piece for both sides, the landscape suddenly changes. This time, there's only one defense against the mate along this diagonal. In our previous position, we saw that black had 2 good ways to survive the attack. He could have played knight f6, or he could have played g6. Knight f6 no longer works. That's because we have extra pieces. Now white would punish it with knight d5, hitting the knight and hitting the queen. If black takes the knight, there goes the defense to h7, you're mated. If he moves the queen, since we're threatening the queen, and he goes queen d8, you simply snap off the knight. And once he recaptures, he's still mated. So this knight f6 defense fails terribly. Okay, that only leaves one now. You have to go g6. And after g6, black's fine. However, chess is a game of a million nuances, and very tiny things can tip over the biggest battleship. Let's make one more adjustment. The adjustment is very small, almost insignificant. White's g-pawn, which was on g3 before, now stands on g2. Yet that changes everything. That slight difference has an enormous impact, because now g6 fails to queen to h3, which wasn't possible before because previously this pawn was blocking that road. After queen h3, we threaten queen takes h7 mate. But now he has to do something about it. If he plays knight f6, we just hit him with that knight move again. And if he takes our knight, we mate him. We pull away the defender. And if he doesn't take it, we're going to take the knight and get rid of the defender and checkmate him anyway. So he's not going to do that. After queen h3, he's going to play h5. And it looks like he's completely safe. One would think he would be. However, another strange thing happens. We first capture here, no big deal. We bring the knight in. He's hit, his queen is attacked. He has to move it. It doesn't matter where he moves it. Let's say he goes back here. And now we get to use one of our other things that we've learned. We go queen takes knight all the way along that diagonal. And the problem is we've just taken a piece for nothing. If he tries to take our knight, we take his rook. So that is just ludicrous for him. But you think, well, why can't he just take my queen? And he does. But because we have that knight here, we have this check. And now we have a family fork. We hit the king, the rook, the queen. This example, in all its phases, is worth looking at over and over, since it shows that many attacks can be successfully nullified. Small, seemingly unimportant changes in a position can have serious consequences. The tactical patterns you learned in lectures 4 and 6 can and often do appear at any moment, and that many powerful mating attacks don't lead to mate. The defender can often find a way to avoid the death of his king, but the collateral damage can mean slow but unavoidable defeat. We have another mate in 1. Previously, we were looking at attacks against h7 with a queen and a knight. Now we're going to do a queen and a bishop. Obviously, the bishop's aimed at h7, the queen's aimed at h7, and so queen takes h7 mate. We're going to be looking at black defending against the mate. Last time, white just checkmated him in one move, but black has a move too, and we're going to give black the move. He can defend with h6. Suddenly, the queen can't mate on h7, it's blocked. And he can defend with g6, blocking the bishop, and all is well. It's pretty simple, but if we give each side one more piece, things change drastically since white has more weaponry aimed at the enemy king. Let's take a look. Black to move, he has absolutely no defense. This is the exact same position as the previous one, except both sides have been given an extra dark squared bishop. That one change leaves black doomed. Black's king, facing immediate mate on h7, has no defense since white has too many attackers aiming in that direction. Since f5 is just met by bishop takes f5, and the mate is still on, and you've just hung a pawn on top of it, black has to look for other ways to survive. The only other moves are pushing the g-pawn or pushing the h-pawn. g6 opens up this whole dark square diagonal, and white can end the game right away with queen takes h7 check, giving up the queen, rook h3 check, and making use of those dark squares along this line, rook h8 mate. Well, black doesn't want that. Nobody wants that unless you're white. Then you want it. So the only other choice, h6. That stops the queen from hitting that square. All right. White now rips open the king. Bishop takes g7. Black takes it. Queen g4 check. Black moves away. Queen to f5, and now once again we threaten a mate on h7. Nothing can help him, so it's up to the king to take care of things himself. So he goes king g7. White comes in, the poor king is flushed out, and checkmate. Notice that this bishop stops him from moving on this square. This whole line is off limits because the rook controls it, and the queen hits the king and also controls both of these squares. So the king can't get a check, checkmate, game is over. As you can see, attacking with one or two pieces usually won't get the job done, but great things are possible if you have a whole battalion zeroing in on the desired target. The massacre started with a simple mate threat against h7, and even though it was black's move, his position rapidly imploded. We saw how a queen and minor piece, bishop or knight, joining together to attack h7 can be a lethal partnership. Another extremely powerful attacking pair is a queen and g6 pawn. We're still going to be working on the weakness of h7. This time, we're going to show you how one little pawn on g6 is a virtual powerhouse. You may think it's worth 1 point, but it's worth a lot more than that. First off, it controls the h7 square, allowing white to come in with his queen and checkmate. It also controls the f7 square, so the king can't run away to that square. So there's really nothing black can do. The only thing he can try is something like bishop e7. You come in thanks to the pawn, and then you just take another little step forward, and it's checkmate, again thanks to the pawn, since the king is not allowed to move there. Clearly, controlling the h7 square puts the enemy king in serious jeopardy. And since queen h7 mates, sacrificing the house is justified if it helps the queen reach that square. Now, if it were black's move, he's just going to come and checkmate you. So white's in a bit of a hurry. Also, if you stop the mate somehow, for example, queen b1, the guy will just take this monster pawn and the guy's king's safe. So white has to come up with something. Of course, if his queen were on this file, he could mate the guy on h7. But he can't. His queen's far away. So it looks like white's in bad shape. However, that's not the case. White goes berserk with rook h8 check. Well, black has no choice. He takes a free rook. Then white checks again. Well, still no choice, but who cares? The guy moves. Then you go down and give your other rook away. And now the guy thinks you've been drinking a little too much. So he takes it. And then you bring your queen over. And you remember I mentioned you could checkmate him if your queen was on this file. And what you've done is you've given both rooks away, but each time with check, so you never allowed him to hit you first. And so he has to move the king, and now we make use of the monster g6 pawn with queen h7 mate. The moral of the story, never underestimate the power of that g6 pawn or the vulnerability of the h7 square. Speaking of the h7 square's vulnerability, one of the most time-honored sacrifices starts with an explosion on h7. It's called the classic bishop sacrifice. Though black is castled, white has too many pieces aimed at black's king. Both white bishops are aiming directly at black's king. His knight is ready to leap in to g5, and the e5 pawn stops the queen or other pieces from landing on f6 to try to aid in the defense. So, in this particular situation, white plays bishop takes h7 check. This kind of sacrifice against black's h7 pawn is called the classic bishop sacrifice. It forces black's king out of its cocoon and allows the rest of the white army to go all out to kill the poor wandering king. In this case, we're going to have him move back to g8 after knight g5 check, which, by the way, also opens up the line for the queen. So the king will retreat back here. There are some other possibilities, or one other possibility. He could go up, but whenever your king is starting to run towards the middle of the board, you know something isn't quite right. For example, white would just play queen to g4, and you know, the king is really suffering through some heat. So we're going to go back with king g8. All right, so here we are, king g8. All right, queen h5. Well, threat's pretty obvious. Queen to h7 mate. There's no way to stop it other than black giving away his queen for the night, and that would be, you know, hopeless. So what black decides to do is make a run for it. He moves out of the way so his king can run to safety, or so he thinks. So white takes the pawn with check, which is guarded, of course, by the knight. The king moves. We go back. The king moves again. Black has no choice anymore. No choice whatsoever. Moves again, and now mate. Pretty brutal. Don't try and memorize any of this. What I would like you to do, though, is go through it many times to get a feel for what happens when a king loses the protective cover of its kingside pawns. White sacrificed a piece to open the enemy king up. Then his pieces rushed into the attack and, after overwhelming the opponent, mated the king. Though the sacrifice can be extremely strong, at times it doesn't work. Factors that make it fail are when a defending knight can move to f6, defending the h7 square and refuting the whole point of the attack, which was to lay claim to h7. Placing a defending queen or bishop on the b1, h7 diagonal when white's army can't achieve the classic queen h7 mating pattern. A black bishop on e7 can chop off the enemy knight when it checks on g5. Let's take a look at some faulty classic bishop sacrifices. Why does the sacrifice fail here? It looks very similar to the other one. The reason it fails is because white does not have a pawn on e5. And by missing that pawn, suddenly the f6 square is available to black. So if white tries the sacrifice, check, check, queen h5 threatening mate, black now has knight f6. Suddenly the queen's attacked and h7 is completely safe, thanks to the knight. Of course, if white had a pawn on e5, he would simply snap it off with his pawn and black would be a goner. But in this case, white's the one that's going to lose the game. You notice that white's critical light-squared bishop is being attacked by both the queen and the pawn. So white has a big decision to make. Should he just play a move like bishop e4, hitting the knight with a perfectly reasonable position? Or should he go for the gusto and play the manly bishop h7 check? Unfortunately, this doesn't work. After king takes, knight check, king comes back, white sets up this mate on h7, but the simple move bishop f5 covers that square and white's attack has completely failed. Once again, we're going to look at a failed classic bishop sacrifice. White has a big advantage here. You notice that he has more space, black's pieces are kind of stuck in there, especially this light-squared bishop. Everything's great. But white decides, I just want to put this guy out of his misery. And so he goes bishop h7 check. Unfortunately, after king takes, when you now play the key knight g5 check, this bishop's on the board. Before we didn't have that. He just snaps the knight off. And suddenly, you don't have enough pieces to attack with. You can bring your queen out, but he just comes back. And there goes, you know, everything. You're two pieces down. The only piece attacking really is your queen and the bishop. It's hopeless, and you can actually resign. So that was just suicide. The need to back up your sacrificial bluster with a well-equipped army is very important. Here white lost his knight without gaining a new attacking unit of some kind. So his army was diminished and ultimately not up for the attacking task. But if we make an adjustment, leaving white's king in the center but placing the h-pawn on h4, suddenly the sacrifice is once again on. Bishop takes h7 check. He takes it. Knight g5 check. He captures your knight. You take back with the pawn, and suddenly the rook is opened up. The guy moves away, and you bring your queen in. Now you threaten mate on h7 or h8. So really, the only hope black has is to move his pawn so he can run. This way, if you check him here, he can actually run here. But then we make use of something we've just talked about a little bit ago, which was the monster pawn on g6. And before checking, you make a mating net. Bam! g6. And now the king has nowhere to go to. Rook e8, all the way down, and it's mate. You've seen black's king drag down on h7 and h8, but squares on f6, g7, and h6 can also become problematic. Here we're going to be looking at the g7 square. Black has a rook and 3 pawns for white's bishop, which gives black a point count advantage of 6 points for white, 8 for black. However, the bishops are really strong. Look at these diagonals here. They cover everything. Incredibly powerful. They're also aiming right at the king. The rook, on the other hand, isn't doing anything. Since chess is a team effort, meaning that you want as many pieces as possible to be working together, white notes that the b2 bishop is staring straight at the g7 pawn, while the b3 bishop is pinning the f7 pawn. It can't move because it would hang the king. How can white's queen join in the fun? Obviously, white should simply go right after that square. He goes queen to g3, and suddenly there's a mating threat. Both these guys are hitting that, and mate is threatened. You can't push the f-pawn because that would hang the king. And so the only move is g6. And now white can force mate with queen to c3. The problem is that white threatens to leap right into the bowels of the guy's position with queen h8 mate or queen g7 mate. And the only way to stop it would be to block it by pushing this pawn to f6, but he can't because this bishop is pinned the pawn. And therefore, mate is unavoidable, and black can either resign or allow white to enjoy himself by making the mating move. Sometimes a weak opponent will willingly create dark square weaknesses in his own position, leading to this kind of kingside structure. Notice these holes, h6, g7, f6. Here, here, here. It's like Swiss cheese. If white has more pieces, he can easily go into these places and ravage the opponent. Of course, we can't always expect help from our opponent. So if you want weaknesses in the enemy camp, you have to go out of your way to create them. In this position, black's bishop is not only strong on this long diagonal, h8 to a1, but it's also covering all these dark squares so that white really can't do much against them. A typical maneuver in situations of this type is either bishop d4 or bishop h6, forcing the exchange of this key bishop and leaving those dark square bishops weak. But, as with most attacking positions, you can only take advantage of enemy weaknesses if you have an available army. 1 or 2 pieces usually won't get the job done. In this situation, black has those holes. White could take advantage of it if he had more pieces. So when you call something a weakness, it's only going to be a weakness in general if you have pieces that can take advantage of those weaknesses. In this case, white doesn't have enough army to bother, and so black is perfectly okay. This position, though black's kingside pawn structure is identical to the previous example, is a very different animal. White has 3 attacking units, the queen, the rook, and the knight, all aiming at the king's side, primed and ready to go after these dark squares. The result will be like night and day. The first move, knight to g4, and suddenly the knight is hitting both squares, f6, h6. In fact, knight h6 check would be checkmate because this whole diagonal is controlled by the queen. So black obviously has to do something right away, else the game will be over. The only real defense is knight to g7, blocking this diagonal so that the king on a check can move to h8 and at least survive for the moment. So white indulges and leaps in. Black has no choice. He has to move over. And then white just sticks his queen right in there. Now he's threatening this pawn 1, 2, 3 times, and black can only guard it twice. In the meantime, black can't move anything. He can't move his king. He can't move his knight. He's completely tied, bound, helpless. So black makes a move, rook e8. White chomps this thing. He moves his king. Notice that if he didn't move the king, if he took, we just take some pieces and we end up with an extra exchange and a pawn, which is way too much. And so after the capture, knight f7 check, he has to move his king, knight h6 check, and now we have a form of back rank mate. Queen takes rook, rook takes, and mate. So you notice that one little change, just the knights, completely transformed the position and the result, and the black squares totally collapsed. So far we've seen weak dark squares fall into the hands of white's queen and bishops, and white's queen, knight, and rook. It's not a surprise that the queen is usually part of most successful hunting parties, since she can be thought of, if you're into Norse legends or Marvel comics, as the hammer of Thor. In the case of weak kingside dark squares, sometimes the game can be won by the pairing of a queen and pawn. White plays pawn f6, taking advantage of the holes on f6 and h6, and forcing a mate by queen to g7. Once you know that basic pattern, you can let your imagination run wild in your efforts to create it. Here's a great example. It's white's move, but black seems to be okay, since if white pushes this pawn, black's queen's just going to eat it. So you haven't succeeded with anything other than giving away a pawn. However, we know that if the pawn can safely reach this square, there's going to be a checkmate on g7. That means that it's worth anything to achieve that. And so we come up with this really strange move, rook c8. Now, normally you would think, well, I'm getting a free rook. What's wrong with this guy? And so he takes it. But then f6 would be mate. Next move, queen mate. So he can't take it. So after rook c8, he has to come up with something else. The problem is if he moves too far away, then you have a checkmate here. Rook takes f8 mate. So he can't do that either. So that pretty much leaves something like queen d6 or queen e7, similar. So queen d6. And now we have a very nice move. Even though the queen is guarding the square, we still push the pawn. And black is faced with two ways to die. If he takes it, he's no longer guarding the rook, and we get a checkmate on f8. The queen was guarding the rook and the pawn. If he takes, after f6, if he takes, of course, the rook, he gets checkmated here. So after f6, there's no defense. You're doomed on the dark squares, and you notice f6, g7, and f8 turned out to be the squares that doomed him. Only 7 lectures have passed, and we've already come a long way together. Aside from the rules and other basics, you've learned tactical and attacking patterns, combinations, and various mating concepts. The next step is experience. If you haven't started playing yet, now is the time to do so. Look for an opponent on Yahoo or the Internet Chess Club or chess.com or the guy next door and try to make use of the attacking patterns you've learned. As with all things, knowledge is extremely important, but without hands-on use, you'll never get to where you want to be. So it's time to go to battle. I'll repeat something I mentioned earlier. Don't worry about losing. All of us, including the world champions, lost countless games at first. If the greats didn't have perseverance, if they gave up in the face of painful defeats and didn't dust themselves off and try over and over again, they wouldn't be the greats. The same goes for you. Chess has a lot to offer, and losing is part of the package.